Hello there. This is the Lesson 3.03 video, Seeking Solutions. As the Great Depression deepened, people looked to government for help. President Hoover responded by asking Congress for a series of interventions and actions that he hoped would stimulate the economy and put people back to work. Some programs helped, some did not, and month after month, more and more people lost their jobs and their homes. Goals for this lesson: identify steps the government took to end the Depression. Assess the need for government intervention in the economy during the Great Depression. Demonstrate mastery of important knowledge and skills learned in previous lessons. Make sure you go to Lesson Resources, grab your reading guide and/or the lesson answer key, and let's begin. Read pages 682 through 685, complete the reading guide, complete the Finding Solutions activity, read the Chapter 30 highlights, and take the 3.03 quiz. Okay, so page 682. Congress takes action. Hoover had always been an idealist who felt that people could sensibly cooperate to make good things happen. But as factories laid off workers or shut down completely, as farmers lost everything, and as banks began to fail by the hundreds, Hoover began pushing for stronger government action to fight the Depression. In late 1931, Hoover proposed forming a chain of federal home loan banks that would lend money to support mortgages, the loans with which people bought homes. For millions of people having trouble meeting their mortgage payments, the measure promised to help them keep their homes. Congress made the bill less generous than the president had hoped. By then, tens of thousands more Americans had gone bankrupt and lost their homes. At Hoover's urging, in January 1932, Congress created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, an unprecedented entry by government into the world of business. The RFC's purpose was to enable the government to lend money directly to banks in order to keep them in business and empower them to resume making loans of their own. An economist at Columbia University remarked that Mr. Hoover is now in process of pushing the government into the banking business. The RFC also made loans to railroads and other businesses. Critics complained the RFC's loans went mostly to big business. While the RFC did not turn back the Depression, it at least helped prevent a complete collapse of the banking system. In July 1932, Hoover signed the Relief and Reconstruction Act, which allowed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to spend up to $1.5 billion on public work projects, such as building highways and parks, in an attempt to create jobs that would put people back to work. The act also provided $300 million to the states so they could make relief payments to their residents. Still, state and local governments could not meet the ever-increasing demands for aid. Most states were, and are, constitutionally bound to operate under a balanced budget, which means they cannot spend more than they take in. But as more and more individuals and businesses went bankrupt, the need for state aid increased, even as states lost tax revenues. Private charities such as the Salvation Army found their resources strained because few people have money to donate. In July 1932, Hoover vetoed a bill that would have authorized relief payments by the federal government. He still feared that letting people become directly dependent on federal aid, even temporarily, would set a dangerous precedent. Another piece of legislation, the 1932 Revenue Act, did more harm than good. Consistent with the economic thinking of his time, Hoover was determined to balance the federal budget. To do this, the government needed to bring in money. The Revenue Act instituted the biggest peacetime tax increases in American history. Even though most of the tax burden was placed on people with higher incomes, the act proved a mistake. Its main effect was to further stall the already crippled national economy. Hoover's decline. By spring of 1932, some 13 million Americans, about a quarter of the workforce, were unemployed. Another quarter only had part-time jobs. Only half of all people who wanted to work held full-time jobs. The mood of the nation was grimmer than ever. Across the country, farmers organized to stop banks from taking away property for which farmers could not meet their loan payments. In Iowa, farmers blockaded roads to keep milk from reaching market, hoping to force its price up. On national radio, the head of the National Farmers Union called rich people cannibals that eat each other and who would live on the labor of the workers. Some people even began to speak of communist revolution and dictatorship. A labor leader testified before the Senate that something is not done and starvation is going to continue. The doors of revolt in this country are going to be thrown open. One priest said, "I wish we might double the number of communists in this country to put the fear, if not of God, then the fear of something else, into the hearts of our leaders." The bonus army. During the summer of 1932, more than 15,000 veterans of World War I came to Washington, D.C. to demand the early payment of bonuses they were owed for military service. But Congress and the President refused to pay the bonus marchers, also known as the bonus army. Many veterans left in frustration, but about 2,000 chose to stay in the capital city. Many of them camped out in protest. On July 28, 1932, the police tried to evict some bonus marchers from buildings they had taken over. The veterans fought back and 2 were shot dead. President Hoover sent in mounted troops to maintain order, but the general in charge of the troops, Douglas MacArthur, exceeded his orders. And we're going to hear about MacArthur later in history, too. He used tear gas to drive the bonus marchers out of their main encampment, which went up in flames. The sight of the United States Army attacking its own veterans was a final blow to whatever standing Hubert Hoover retained among the American public. The president became the butt of bitter jokes. For example, an empty pocket, turned inside out, was called a Hoover flag. The election of 1932. As the presidential election of 1932 approached, the Republican Party nominated Hoover for re-election. The worn-down president, who had worked himself to exhaustion trying to deal with the Great Depression, barely seemed to want the job. He did not campaign until the month before the election. His opponent was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York. At the Democratic nominating convention, Roosevelt declared, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. On Election Day, Hoover won only 6 states. A nation desperate for change elected Roosevelt in a landslide. In 1932, the Constitution still designated March 4th as the presidential inauguration date. The date was later changed to January 20th. Consequently, 4 long, painful months passed before Roosevelt became president. During that period, one of Roosevelt's advisors told the president-elect, by March 4th, next we may have anything on our hands from recovery to revolution. The chance is about even either way. And this picture here on the lower left, unemployed World War I veterans, those bonus marchers, camped out in protest but were soon driven away by federal troops. And that's where we will stop reading because the next chapter begins on the other lesson. So let's go back to our lesson. Congress takes action. Hoover tried to end the Great Depression. He looked for ways to relieve the dire problems confronting both businesses and people. He wanted to get the nation back on its economic feet, but he did not believe the federal government could provide direct assistance or spend more than it collected in taxes. By 1932, unemployment was nearly 25% and thousands of Americans were starving and homeless. How would you solve the problems Hoover faced in 1932? First, you would need to assess people's needs. What was most immediately important in terms of aid? How could you get the nation's economy running again? And how could you ensure this would never happen again? And then it's asking you to complete in your history journal some reflection questions there that are in the bullet points. Remember, your history journal is not submitted. It's just simply your own note-taking, your own reflection. You can go into as much depth as you want in your history reflections. This is President Hoover here in the middle of the picture. That's President Herbert Hoover. Let's go through the Chapter 30 highlights before you take your 3.03 quiz. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday marked the onset of the economic crisis known as the Great Depression. The faulty belief that stock prices would continue climbing had caused investors to speculate, buy stock on credit or margin, raising stock prices far beyond their value. While urban poverty and the discrepancy between the rich and poor grew, farm families suffered hardships that began in the 1920s. As people lost purchasing power, production slowed, leading to widespread unemployment. Thousands of banks failed. The international economy suffered when European nations could not repay their loans and the United States imposed high tariffs. The removal of native grasses, drought, and high winds created a dust bowl in the Great Plains, and many people who lived there, known as Okies, left for California. Unemployment, malnutrition, soup kitchens, and declines in marriage and birth rates characterized the Great Depression. President Herbert Hoover supported the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Relief and Reconstruction Act, and the 1932 Revenue Act, but the Depression worsened. By 1932, with approximately 25% of the population unemployed, U.S. troops firing on veterans waiting to collect bonuses, and homeless people living in Hoovervilles, the United States was ready for new leadership under Franklin Roosevelt. So make sure that you review lessons 3.01, 3.02, and 3.03 before you complete the 3.03 quiz. Good luck on your quiz, and this lesson is complete.